voices. So we are on Mitzvah 146. We were talking about, no, we're on Mitzvah 147.
Just before,
before
we get to 147, when we were talking about Gilgulim, is there any intimations of that in the Zohar?
I am not
okay
familiar with the entire Zohar, but I am told that that there's lots of discussion of it. But I'm not that familiar with it. I know in the writings of the Arizal, there's a great deal. In fact, he has an entire work. I mean, I don't think when we say the writings of the Arizal, we really mean the writings of Rabbi Chaim Vital.
Yes.
So there's a book called either called the Sefer or the Shar of Gilgulim, and it's all devoted to it. It doesn't as far as my very cursory understanding of it, it doesn't discuss the concept, from A to Z. It doesn't start off by explaining what they are and how they work. It sort of jumps in into who's a Gilgul of who and stuff like that. But I'm led to understand that if you went through those writings, you'd have a kind of topography of how it works. I mean, I think there would still be, because there's ideas introduced, this notion that somehow a soul can be split up, and that there could be more than one person alive that is a reincarnation of that person. There's some ideas that get thrown in that just bend even the kind of full picture that people try to develop of it. There are ideas that sort of bend the boundaries of that lead you to agree at the end that we don't fully understand it. But
it's hard to give an explanation of exactly what it is. Is it an identity? Is it a resemblance? Is it numerically the same? Is it
right? Yeah. So you get a lot of those, and there's like different angles. Like once you've come up with a picture, there's a different perspective, and it just almost does away with the first picture that you have. The Vilna Gaon has a commentary on the book of Yonah, which I once had and learned, which sees the book of Yonah as a Gilgul, that it's talking about that Yonah is a euphemism for the soul, and that when he goes into the fish, that's a kind of death, and then when he gets spit out, it's a reincarnation. And so there's a way of reading the book of Yonah that it's about Gilgulim. Certainly the Vilna Gaon suggested that, and it could be there are other in Tanakh. This is something, again, I don't know. I know the one about Yonah, and I had seen it, but it could be that there are other places throughout Tanakh that people learning on that level see it as a discussion of Gilgulim. Because one of the questions is, if this is true, then why don't we see it reflected in Tanakh? Why don't you see it discussed in the Gemara? So you'd have to say that they had this, for some reason, Gilgulim just got different treatment than some of the other discussions that sort of made their way from the mystical teachings into more common spheres. For some reason, Gilgulim was kept, tight-lipped. Again, it eventually there are discussions of it in mystical writings already, but for some reason, not even like Olam Haba. There's a great effort. There's an effort by the Gemara itself to show that Olam Haba, that the world to come, is being referenced in all throughout the Torah and all throughout Navi, and Nevi'im Ksuvim, even though it doesn't necessarily strike you as being referred to, but the Gemara makes great efforts. In fact, the Gemara says that if you don't think Olam Haba is referenced in the Torah, that makes you a heretic. Because that was how important it was for them to say that about Olam Haba. For some reason, the same effort is not made about Gilgulim. And obviously they felt that Olam Haba is so important that they just have to make an extra effort to cement it into the minds of people. And then, some of the nature of Olam Haba, the reward and punishment part of it, it was so important that they felt like that they have to reveal. But Gilgulim doesn't seem to get the same treatment for some reason. I will say I've been thinking about it for the last couple of years, but the last couple of weeks I'm trying to live with the idea that for some reason it's different than these other things, that they didn't feel the same imperative to talk about it. Because again, they didn't have to talk about the details of Olam Haba. The Torah doesn't feel it needs to discuss it in detail. Even the Mishnah and the Gemara that talk about it, it's very like poetic. And Navi, like Yeshayahu or other people that are referencing it, they're very happy for it to remain as a kind of poetic thing. But with Gilgulim, they don't even go there. At least they're not fleshing it out. They don't feel the need to, which is sort of interesting. And that's the part I'm trying to live with, which is why,
right? Yes,
why they don't want to. What makes it different than the details of what happens to the soul after we die? But in as far as the world of souls and Trias and Mason and other kinds of things, where they really, at least even from the time of the Gemara, are giving direction that it should be more fleshed out than it is. So I don't know. Yeah.
Rabbi.
Yeah. Hi, Estelle.
I'm not sure what Gilgul means.
It's the term most often used to refer to reincarnation. And reincarnation is different than resurrection of the dead. Resurrection of the dead is called Tchiat HaMeitim, that the dead, which literally means the dead will live. Now that's considered one of the really important foundations of the Jewish worldview. The Maimonides includes it in his list of the principles of knowledge or principles of faith that a Jew must have, which is a belief, or in his language more a knowledge, that at some point in the future, body and soul come back together, however that plays out, whatever it looks like, but something that we would call body and soul come back together. So that's called resurrection of the dead. This is a different idea, which is that, because even with resurrection of the dead, that's not necessarily something that happens. It's something that's going to happen. In other words, it's not, resurrection of the dead would not happen during our era. Resurrection of the dead is going to happen in some future time. Reincarnation is the notion that after a person passes away, which when we speak of a person passing away, in simple terms, this is what the Moshe Chaim Luzzatto says, in simple terms, what we mean is the soul and body separate. The soul and body separate. So what happens to the soul after it separates from the body? So there is this notion, which is that the soul can, and I'm going to add the words most likely will, enter some kind of new body. In fact, it's not even, if based on even just based on stories, which are in the common culture, it wouldn't necessarily have to be a human. It could, and that's a whole nother thing, what to do about this idea, but it could enter an animal, or it could even enter a plant. But somehow the soul has another life, in quotations, and this life is for the purpose of continuing the work of the previous soul, perhaps doing unfinished business, or maybe fixing something that the soul had been involved with previously, so that there's, in one way of characterizing it, the purpose of it is that the soul would go through these various stages until it has perfected itself, and then it would move on to something else, the world of souls, or the world to come eventually. So this is called, it's often called Gilgul. Gilgul means like a wheel, or like a galgal, or like a cycle, but it would be this idea that you're going through around and around, during into, again, new, what we would call life, in quotations, experiences that would allow for either the continuation of the work of the soul, or the rectification of something that the soul had done previously that needs to be fixed. So that this says, it's been something, for some reason, that keeps on coming back to my mind.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So last time when we were on 146, which was the mitzvah of shchita, so the Rambam had mentioned that he sort of alluded to the fact that there was a time, the time in the desert, where they could not eat meat, but now they're going, in other words, they could eat meat that wasn't part of a sacrifice, that they could eat meat that was part of a sacrifice, but they could not eat meat that was not part of a sacrifice. So this command is not just teaching how to slaughter meat, or that there is a way to slaughter the meat, but the command is also signaling that it's going to be eventually permitted to eat meat that was not sacrificial, because during the time when they were in the desert, they were not able to do that. So when we say meat, we mean mammals that chew their cud and have split hooves. Even though, and this is what we were talking about a little bit last time, even though birds are also called meat in the Torah, the people ask for meat and they're given quail. So birds are called meat in the Torah, but birds do not seem to have been included in the prohibition. Whatever the purpose for that prohibition was, to eat non-sacrificial cattle and sheep and goats, for the most part, that's what, or gazelles or whatever else they might have had access to. That doesn't seem to have been an issue with birds. Just pointing that out as an interesting thing. when we're talking about the various categories of food that we eat. So there's vegetable material or fruit, grains, and then there's fish, birds. I don't know if you want to put these as a branch of birds, but there's certain grasshoppers you can eat, and then cattle, mammals that chew their cud and have split hooves. So at different points in the Torah, they sort of enter, they sort of share in a group, and sometimes they're separated. Like, for instance, fish do not have to be shechted, even though we think of them as a food that like meat and fowl, but they don't have to be shechted. We're going to see, but fowl do have to be shechted. But for instance, fowl biblically are not prohibited to mix with milk. Like fish are not prohibited to eat with milk, although Sephardic Jews, there are many Sephardic Jews that do not mix fish and milk. This is based on a statement of the Rabbi Yosef Karo. There's some people who think that this statement is a typo, but it's not treated that way by the Sephardic community. There are a lot of people that will not, amongst the Sephardic community. So, for instance, there are Sephardic Jews that would consider it wrong to eat bagels, lox, and cream cheese. As hard as that is to assimilate. So, anyways, but for the most part, we, except for that community, fish you could mix with milk, and fowl you could mix with milk. There also seems to be this difference with fowl, that you could eat fowl while they were in the desert, but unless it was sacrificial, they couldn't eat what we think of typically as meat. This caused me to wonder if, let's say, Adam and Eve, when Adam and Eve are told what they can eat, they're told that they can eat like the fruit and vegetable and grain material. And so we assume based on that they could not eat meat, but could they eat fish? Could they eat fowl? So that would be interesting to explore. So in some ways, these they fit into a category. For instance, sacrifices. When it comes to sacrifices, there are bird offerings, and there are cattle, sheep, and goat offerings. So that's would be, if you're doing a Venn diagram, that would be an area where they cross over, where the cattle and sheep and goats are part of the same category as birds, but fish are on the out. I once found a midrash that asked, why don't we have fish offerings? And the answer in that midrash was because fish don't have faces like people. It seemed like, according to the midrash, that if you're going to use a formerly living creature, you want it to be something that people could sort of identify with, where it doesn't have it. Now we have grain offerings. Grain offerings don't have a face either. But anyways, that's what the midrash says. But you don't have fish offerings, but you do have bird offerings. So here's one, even within the animal category. This is something where birds and certain types of mammals are in a class together. And that is, he commanded us to cover the blood of a wild animal or bird after they are slaughtered. So if you were in a slaughterhouse, a Schlachthaus, and they were shechting a cow, let's say a steer, a bull, let's say or a cow, and they're shechting it, so there's lots of blood. Now, obviously, you want to do something about the blood, but there's no separate mitzvah to cover the blood. When you shecht a bird, you actually, this is part of the ritual. You shecht the bird, and then you take some earth and you cover where the bird bled on the ground, you cover that with earth. That's called kisui hadam, covering the blood. You actually make a bracha when you do it. It's a separate mitzvah. That's what we're reading. So when you shecht a bird, and also if you shecht something called a chaya. A chaya is often translated as an undomesticated animal. So for instance, bison. Bison is categorized as a chaya. So bison, when they were shechting a lot of bison, I don't know if they still do. I don't see it as much as we used to see it when it was a kind of novelty option at restaurants and places. I don't see it as much. But when they were shechting bison, there actually is a mitzvah of kisui hadam. So it would be different than just shechting a cow. They would actually have a separate mitzvah to take earth and cover the blood with earth, even if they're going to eventually wash it away with some kind of spraying, like a hose or something. But before they do any of that, you have to take earth and cover it with earth to fulfill this mitzvah. With the same thing with let's say a deer or wild goats or gazelles or things like that, where you'd have to, when you shecht it. So here's one where birds and undomesticated animals are in a category separate from domesticated animals, and certainly fish and grasshoppers that don't even need shechita. That is his, may he be exalted, saying, he shall pour out its blood and cover it with earth. The regulations of this commandment have already been explained in chapter 6 of Kulin. You could imagine that when you're thinking about why, you could imagine that this is a kind of respect for the life force of the animal, a way of showing respect. It's sort of like burying the life force, as it were. It's interesting. We don't have a mitzvah to bury unused parts of animals. And maybe that's because if we're already shechting them, we're expected to try to use everything from the animal that wasted. But let's say you came across a dead animal, there isn't a separate mitzvah to bury the animal. When we're told about burial, the site where we're drawn to is actually a mitzvah that takes place after you kill somebody. If the courts order the execution of somebody based on the laws of the Torah, so the person is meant to hang for a while after they were killed, briefly, and then they're supposed to be taken down and buried. And it says, because he is in the form of God, he's B'Tselem Elokim. So there's some kind of specific relationship between burial and Tselem Elokim, and the fact that the human form is connected to God's image. It's interesting when people talk about the concept of Tselem Elokim, what it means that that the human is made in God's image. We are led away from the body. We're often led away from the body. That we're told that this might be our in the fact that we have an intellect, or that we're able to make decisions, make choices, make free choices. we're told in some mystical works like the work Nefesh HaChaim, written by Chaim of Volozhin, where he suggests that the human, it's more like the human soul, that the human is made in the form of the universe, and that our soul is made of the stuff of the universe, and that we're able to interact with all aspects of the universe, but we're typically led away from the body as that which was created in God's image. But over there, that's all that's left of the person is the body. And so we're told that that is in the image of God. Now, you could say that it doesn't mean that just the body, but even the human form causes us to think of the whole person. This is part of this discussion about what is the body, what is the human body from a spiritual perspective. What is it? The human is characterized as being made up of the clay of the earth and God's breath, which is blown into the human. That's how it's described in the second chapter of Bereshis, of Genesis. But what we, especially in the last several hundred years, where there's been a lot more emphasis on the nature of the soul, what is the soul, and the nature of the human being, more and more emphasis is placed on the soul as opposed to the body. This is, I guess, one of the questions that comes up from that discussion of reincarnation. How important is the body if a person has had many bodies? It seems like if you're identifying the person at its core, a person, you'd have to say the person is their soul, not their body. And you'll hear people quip that instead of thinking of yourself as a body that has a soul, you should be thinking of yourself as a soul that has a body. And that in a sense, life is the journey of a soul in this, with this, in connection with this body, but eventually this body's going to go, and then it's going to have another body, or it's going to go into a plane without a body. Even according to Maimonides, even resurrection of the dead is temporary, and eventually we're just the soul. So you're drawn to think of yourself more and more and more as a soul that's having a human, like an earthly experience, and that the body is your container, or your locomotion, your vehicle, while you're on this plane. But primarily, you're the soul. But every once in a while, there are statements in the Torah that that are uncomfortable if you think that way. I forgot what his name is. Who wrote? There was a book about scientific revolutions, where it was a sort of famous book. I had it for a while. A friend of mine, Gedalia Orntlicher of blessed memory, lent it to me. But he's talking about how you have a certain dominant.
Isn't it Thomas Kuhn?
Yes.
Structure of scientific revolution. Right.
Thank you, Lois. So one of the things one of his notions, as he's trying to explain how things have moved the way they do when it comes to ideas within the scientific community, is that you'll have this dominant understanding, and there'll be little questions, or maybe, I don't know, looking back, they might be big questions, but they're experienced as these little questions that suggest that there's something incomplete about this theory. But initially, they're just put aside as just some, a little annoyance, or a little fluff, something that just, it'll get resolved kind of thing, until they start to aggregate, and you get bigger and bigger bundle of questions, and then eventually the old theory falls to replace by a new theory. So you have Newton. There were already problems people had with Newton's understanding of the cosmos, but they might be slightly irritating, but they were tolerated until at some point it just the questions became too big, and then eventually it falls and something else replaces it. I mean, it doesn't entirely fall, but as the principle. So it's this way with these kind of these kind of ideas, like especially you have to be suspect of anything that just can be said in a soundbite. It can be said in a soundbite. It just probably is not complete. And so this notion that I'm a soul that has a body as a kind of vehicle for its experience in this world is not a complete idea. It's not entirely that. If it would be, I'm suggesting it's not entirely that, because there are little irritating things in the Torah that suggest otherwise. Like, for instance, the citing for why we bury the body. It identifies. So you could say it doesn't mean it literally that the body is Tzelem Elokim. What it means is that's what we've always been looking at, and so we associate the Tzelem Elokim with the body. But it's not that the body's the Tzelem Elokim. It's just that, all right, fine, but it's a little bit irritating, and you're not totally getting rid of the problem by doing it. Another one for me is when Avram buries Sarah. They at least once, and I think more than once, it identifies the body as Sarah, his wife. Now, if the body is just the vehicle for Sarah, then it's not precise to call the body Sarah. Sarah is not there. It's just the body of Sarah that was there. If you like Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik is noted for saying that, bless his memory, he's noted for saying that why do we bury the body? Because the body is a container for Torah. It's a container for Torah. There's a difference in how we treat items that are Torah or connected to Torah and items that are just mitzvah or connected to mitzvah. So, for instance, after you finish with an esrog, so during the time of Sukkot, the esrog is a mitzvah object, and we treat it as sacred. Once Sukkot is over, it's no longer sacred. It was a mitzvah object, but it's no longer sacred. Technically, you do not have to bury it. In fact, you could use it for something else. Like, let's say you want to use it for Havdalah when you are smelling a special fragrance, or there's some people who put not peppercorns, but they put cloves inside. Put cloves in the esrog, and they use it as part of their Havdalah things. So they're not burying it. They're using it for something else. You're not supposed to completely disrespect it, but you can throw it in the garbage. You could wrap it and throw it in the garbage. That's a mitzvah object, as opposed to something that is part of a Torah, has Torah written on it. Even the wood Eitz Chaim of the Torah, they are all supposed to be buried. There is a halachic distinction between items that are connected to Torah and items that are connected to even just to mitzvah. So he suggests that when we bury the body, it's a testament to the fact that the body is connected to Torah. It's a vessel for Torah. Um, but again, it's a holy vessel. Okay, it's a sacred vessel. It's a holy vessel, but it's not the person. Don't we say that we're a soul that has the body as a kind of vehicle? But once the soul is left, that is not the person anymore. We bury it because it was a sacred container for the Torah, but it's nobody's saying it's the Torah itself. It's just a vessel for the Torah. But you don't always see that precisely in the description of the Torah. So that's why I'm suggesting that this distinction that we make simply by saying we're the soul and the body is a vessel for the soul or a vehicle for the soul is not it in its entirety, but it is useful. It's very useful to think about it, especially when we think about our own death. When we think about our own death, it's very important, I think, to be able to make that distinction. It's very useful meditation, a very useful way of thinking, to understand that we've existed before and we're going to exist afterwards, and that this right now, our body is a temporary vehicle for this plane that we're on, and then we're going to move on to another experience. And the sort of more you can do that, the easier it is to deal with our own mortality. But again, it's not completely neat. There are those who use like I used this when I was talking to my children when they were young, that they when they were first broaching the subject of death and afraid of being buried in the ground. So I use this metaphor of, I think I got it from some movie, some Mormon movie, I think, but it was a very useful metaphor, that the body is like a coat. You wear the coat, you're wearing a coat, and eventually you take the coat off, you put it in the closet, and then, so let's say you're coming in from the outside and it's very cold and you're wearing your coat, then you come inside, close the door, you open the closet, you take off your coat, you put it in the closet, and then you move on. Now, the closet is a dark, enclosed space, but you're not afraid that your coat is in the closet. You're not experiencing the darkness of the closet because it's just the coat, and your coat's in the closet, but your awareness is not in the closet. Your awareness is walking around the house. In fact, I once heard this. I've heard it from more than one source. One source I heard it from was Rabbi Moshe Soloveitchik from Chicago. But I believe I heard this in the name of the Maharal also. But the question was, when Adam and Eve, after they eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, one of the first reactions they have is shame at their nakedness. They're ashamed of their nakedness. So why is this emphasized? So he suggested that the reason it's emphasized is because it shows us a shift in perception. Before they ate from the tree, they experienced the world as a soul contained by a body. So when they moved in the world, they were not exposed. They were surrounded by the body. Their awareness was from internal. Their awareness was from the perspective of their soul. Their body was clearly an outer sort of protective covering. And so they were not exposed. But after they ate from the tree, their identity shifts. And now they see the world from the perspective of their body, not from the perspective of the soul. So so now that they're seeing the world from the perspective of their body, they're exposed. There is no covering. There is nothing to protect them on the outside. So they are exposed. That shame is a expression of being exposed and vulnerable. And so it's describing a kind of shift in perception. So we, post-tree, tend to identify ourselves as our body, and that's even expressed in the prayer Elokai Neshama. There's a prayer that is said every morning, and it says Elokai Neshama shenatata bi tahorahi. God, the soul that you gave to me or placed within me is pure. Why am I talking about the soul as another? Aren't I my soul? But this sort of acknowledges this shift in perception. Now, the mystics would say you need to try to correct it. You need to work back to seeing the world from the perspective of your soul and your body as the vehicle for your soul. But that's a correction you have to make, because our tendency is to see ourselves as a body that has a soul as opposed to a soul that has a body. So you're drawn to this. The thing is that it doesn't allow you to do this entirely, but you're drawn to this discussion and this thinking when it comes to this mitzvah, because I'm covering the life force of the animal. At different places it says hadam hu hanefesh. The blood is the spirit, the life spirit. So by covering it, you would think that's an act of dignity to cover the life spirit of it. Again, this is incomplete, because if that's the case, why don't we bury the animal afterwards? And even if you'll say we're going to eat it or use whatever, then bury the part you're not, or bury the ones that you're not using. Also, why is it only the blood of birds and non-domesticated animals? Why isn't domesticated animals? But it calls you to this. It initially calls you to it, to think about it, and then what you're supposed to do with it, I'm not sure, because you have these other issues. Okay, that was that. I look forward to meeting with you guys, but not next week, because next week during Sukkot, my schedule is just not in my hands for next week. So we're going to meet after Sukkot, that Monday after Sukkot, after Simchas Torah. That will be our next meeting, which I look forward to.
Thank you, Rabbi.
All right.
Thank
Be well, guys.
Thank you, Rabbi.
We don't know.
Well.
A wonderful Chag.
you.
You too. You too.
Okay.
A beautiful, beautiful Sukkot. Be well.
Bye-bye.